On behalf of the Committee on Ministerial Care, welcome. This is David Haney, the Committee's Director of Ministerial Care. Our webinar today is part of the Committee's ongoing efforts to provide support to ministers who are facing some of the common challenges of pastoral ministry. In our last webinar, Reverend Lendall Smith interviewed John and Lindsay Fikkert regarding self-care strategies for ministers and their wives. Most of that discussion centered around awareness and preventative steps which pastors can take to maintain their emotional and spiritual health. Today's webinar, Coping with Exhaustion and Burnout in Pastoral Ministry, will expand that conversation to address the minister who finds himself at or approaching a point of emotional or spiritual exhaustion. Our guests today are both practicing professionals in the mental health field. Dr. Lindsay Fikkert is a licensed clinical psychologist and serves as an adjunct professor at Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi. Her husband, Reverend John Fikkert, is a licensed mental health counselor and an Orthodox Presbyterian minister serving as the associate pastor of Hope Reformed Presbyterian Church in Pella, Iowa. Our moderator today is Reverend Lendall Smith, the president of the Committee on Ministerial Care. Lendall, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, David, and welcome again to you, John, and to Lindsay on this second webinar that we've done together. On the first webinar, we talked about the side of self-care and personal stewardship as preventative and helpful to a long-term ministry. Just take a few moments for our viewers to review briefly what we've covered on that topic of seeing self-care as a preventative measures for a lengthy ministry and effective ministry. John, I'll just start.
Yeah, I would say that self-care appropriately at appropriate levels, attending to what you need to care for yourself in terms of physical needs, mental and intellectual needs, and also spiritual needs, paying attention to those things, and then also paying attention to the rituals and routines that we set up for ourselves and being intentional about those. And also maintaining good boundaries as part of good self-care, of identifying those boundaries of where I begin and another person ends. And we really led that last discussion emphasizing the spiritual, and especially the gospel, and grounding yourself in the gospel as really good self-care going forward. And that would probably be the main thing that I would want to highlight as we think about self-care going forward. As a minister who takes care of his own soul and his own heart is going to be well set up, not just in his individual life, but for ministry as well.
Okay. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Lindsay, as far as reviewing the dynamics of self-care that we've covered?
Just to say, again, that self-care is about sustainability. It's not about selfishness or indulgence. It's about doing what you need to do preventatively to make it more doable in the long run, to make ministry and a life of service more manageable in the long run. So that would be the primary thing. And also, for various reasons, different stressors come into our life, and just because we maybe have really good routines in place and we've done some of the things that John and I have been talking about in the previous webinar, it doesn't mean that burnout is never going to happen. And I think just sometimes just the life of ministry is a hard one, and it's a rewarding one, but a hard one. And so to be aware that you may have great routines in place, and you may be attending to all of these things, but sometimes we do get burnout.
That leads us to our topic, doesn't it? We hear a lot about. Oftentimes, colleagues that will talk about, I feel burned out in the ministry, and that suggests a certain fatigue or a certain weariness that comes in ministering to others, and it often does. The demands of a schedule are hard at times, it fluctuates, and that takes a certain toll on an individual who's serving as a minister to others in a congregation. So that's what we'd like to talk about today. How would you characterize burnout and how to deal with it, John?
I would say your lead-in, your expression of fatigue, there's just a level of exhaustion there. I think that's a really helpful beginning point. If we just continue to use that, typically burnout refers to I'm emotionally exhausted, or sometimes physically. It's hard to get up in the morning and keep going. Or spiritually, I just don't have the energy to pray the way that I think I should pray. Something is wrong. In some way, I'm meeting with a limit about myself that isn't normal. This isn't just a weekly or daily, I didn't get enough sleep last night, but I've reached a threshold where I feel exhausted.
So what to do about that, or how to analyze that, even in greater depth, a certain fatigue? How would you go about looking at that and saying what is going on in that? How would you analyze that? Maybe it's different in different people, but are there some general things we might say about that kind of fatigue or that kind of exhaustion that might be helpful to those watching?
I think one of the things that we've both talked about is a little bit about how that could actually be a gift in different ways. I don't know if you wanted to say more about that.
Well, just to follow up on the last webinar, sometimes suffering and even burnout can be an invitation to explore parts of our lives that perhaps have gotten out of sync, and ways that we've not attended to things we needed to. So if we think of burnout as just all negative, that this is a bad thing and you need to fix this right away, and we don't actually see that perhaps there's something for us to learn in it and through it, and maybe there's an opportunity to be shaped and grown through this occasion. I think that's where we need to focus when we find ourselves at that point. What needs to change? And resiliency is about the ability to bounce back after something is pressed down. And so to think of this as an opportunity or an invitation, an occasion for the Lord to shape us and grow us in new ways is our perspective on burnout in our own lives and lives of others. So.
The word lurking behind this is sanctification. So where a burnout is some sort of a checkpoint. We're at some sort of a place where we are in an uncomfortable or an unusual place, and how are we being sanctified right now? Or what's happening in my walk with Christ at this time?
Okay, because that's just what I was just thinking, that at some point, I'm not sure of the dynamics or how to address that. Is there a feeling of being in over our head, or maybe we're engaged we're trying to do things in ministry for which we have the wrong expectations? Or I guess, what are the factors that are involved? Because it really, you do hear this a lot. Is it loneliness? Is it just, I feel like I'm not accomplishing what I should be accomplishing? I don't know all the ways to express that.
I think it starts with prayerful discernment and assessment of what's happening with this burnout. And a lot of times that looks like, okay, how long has this been going on? So what is the duration that I've been experiencing this? And how severe is it? Am I just feeling a little bit fatigued, and maybe a couple of tweaks here and there would bring this time period to a close? Or is the intensity severe? And really discerning that. And then also, how often am I feeling this way? Is it every day? Am I feeling this, just every now and then, or on certain occasions? So I think it begins with really discerning, prayerful assessment of what's happening. I don't know if you'd like to say more about that, but that's the starting point with burnout.
Yeah.
I think a common feature for many pastors, and I know it's true for me, is the Monday morning blues. where we have all the disappointments and things we wished we'd said in a sermon or in ministry the previous day. We're emotionally exhausted, we're more vulnerable. So that can happen sometimes, and just to be aware, is this the Monday blues, or is this something more significant than that? Would be one of the checkpoints that I would have when asking, like, I feel really down about ministry right now.
Would you say that burnout then is an extension of Monday morning blues, or is it something far deeper than that? That's kind of an emotional response that I don't think any of us are foreign to, in the sense, I wished I'd have preached a better sermon, I wished I had said things differently, or I wished I could have seen more tangible response. Those are thoughts that we might have Monday, but is burnout just a deeper way of saying there's something going on in my life in response to ministry that I'm tired of, or I'm just plain tired, or I'm not able to meet the demands of the situation that I'm in? How would you think about that? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think you're describing it well, where the Monday morning blues might be like that immediate, like, pain in your shoulder because you threw a ball too hard, whereas
Now you're talking to an old timer.
but burnout is when your arm just feels tired because you've been throwing and throwing and throwing,
Yeah.
and you just don't feel like you can throw another pitch, and so it's that chronic nature of, I feel really stuck right now. And that's where that self-assessment piece comes in, of assessing what I feel in distress right now. I feel uncomfortable. What is this? And is this temporary, or has this been building, and is this a bad place to be?
It sounds like a little bit, Lindsay, from what you've said, that I really drawn to this assessment that needs to take place. But it almost seems like help is needed sometimes to do that assessment. And I guess that's where, if you have somebody that you're a confidant, I think you used that word before, confidant of someone that you can talk to, or someone that you can, an elder or a friend that you can try to put that in perspective. Is that, it seems like that may be a critical help at that point.
Absolutely. I think having relationships where people will tell you the truth. You know, is there something different about the way I've been preaching lately, for example? And I can think of an example from long ago, earlier in my life, where I could hear a shift in the way the pastor was preaching over time, right? And sometimes I think there are people in our life who can give us information about that kind of thing. You know, do I seem less patient with people when they come to me with pastoral needs, and perhaps a friend or a spouse or an elder can speak to that in really particular ways.
If a spouse, that's again, picking up on your words, but if a spouse, perhaps a spouse is likely to detect that as one of the first ones, to be aware of that's going on in her husband's ministry. Any suggestions along that? What do you do next, or even to approach the subject, or any suggestion along the line of how you begin to get a handle on that situation? Because I'm sure that happens.
I think typically any kind of feedback given needs to start with curiosity and compassion rather than just feedback. So
You seem angry.
right. So just being curious about what's happening in your husband's heart and what's been going on for him, and then compassionately and gently inquiring about that, and then perhaps giving feedback. I've noticed this, and knowing that feedback is hard and it might not get taken well, especially at first, but to gently give it, and then to be willing to sit and pray together about it and be prayerful for your husband about that. Perhaps that's even the starting point before that conversation begins. So that's, to me, that's an important piece of being a loving wife to someone in ministry, is being willing to kind of watch things ebb and flow in the life of your husband, and being willing to pray about those and speak gently and lovingly when you see those happen in a way that seems concerning. So,
I think that's very helpful. Say you make the assessment. All right, I'm burned out. We kind of make that conclusion that for whatever, do the assessment of the situation, personal assessment, say, yeah, I'm just plain tired. What change? How do you go about making a change? Or what do you do then? What would you suggest?
That's a really good question. I think it's kind of a multi-part question, so we'll have to try to tackle it a little bit at a time. But I think one thing to refer back to the self-care things would be examining, am I taking care of myself the way that I need to be, and are there ways that are coming up short? That would be one part of it. Another part would be beyond your wife, seeking feedback from other people about how they understand your ministry. We're not always accurate perceivers of our ministry. I often think of Elijah and how he viewed his ministry in a very different way from what the Lord had to tell him about his ministry. And we, as pastors, we have that same vulnerability where we may not be accurately assessing the situation. We can get very down on how we're preaching or how something is going in the church, and somebody might be able to come along, perhaps an elder or your wife, and say, actually, that was a faithful sermon. We heard the gospel this week. It was exegetically sound, and sometimes it's that sort of feedback that's really important for correcting some of the perceptions that we might have about ourselves. But you need to seek feedback in order to do that. You can't isolate yourself. You're going to be very stuck. And I find that isolation is very often when burnout starts to accelerate and become a more severe problem, is when we feel isolated.
I really, when you said, you have to do that a personal assessment, that you really have to go back and say, are the things that I have not been using in personal stewardship, maybe working through vacations or not finding healthy projects to do outside of the ministry or hobbies? I think you talked about all those things in a way to kind of refresh and renew yourself as an individual, as a servant. I thought that was really a good point, that how important this kind of personal stewardship is in a long-term ministry, especially.
Do I have healthy boundaries with other people?
Exactly.
Am I over-functioning in the church in different ways? How in tune am I with what's going on with me emotionally? Can I identify what's going on? Are there what my fears are, or what I feel guilty about, or what I might feel ashamed of even? Do I know what those things are? Have I confessed those things to the Lord or not? And it's just kind of walking through some of those self-care ideas after you don't feel good.
Is it sometimes dealing with a situation where the circumstances may not, and it's not necessarily the individual that's doing things wrong, but maybe the circumstances with which he is faced also brings that about? Difficulties that maybe he's not difficult to deal with, doesn't want to deal with it. Is that what would you suggest then?
I think there are times where you find yourself in a church or on a session, among elders, or even in a family, where your attempts to be faithful with all those little aspects of daily stewardship are met with resistance. And there are times where, I think about churches and families as systems, right? And anytime you change something within the system, the system in some ways works to push back and try to keep things the same. There's kind of an ecology to our families and to the groups that we're a part of. And when you meet that resistance, it can be hard sometimes because not every environment or situation supports your health and your self-care. And so we have to have a willingness to displease others at times and to be willing to say no and to be willing to say yes to other things and recognize that not every person is going to support what we need to do in order to sustain ministry for the long run. So
Can't please all the people all the time.
no.
If you're stuck in people pleasing, it's a sure road to exhaustion. Another piece that I would add to that is, and I want to say this carefully, but there are times where what feels like burnout may just be the end of a call. And assessing, has this call come to an end? Have I fulfilled what the Lord has called me to do at this place, and do I need to consider a different ministry? And I say that with caution because every time we feel exhausted, if we look for a new call, that's probably not a good pattern. But I think it's appropriate to assess, where am I in this call that I'm in with a particular church?
You know, John, you and I work in a Presbyterian setting, and we work with elders, we work with sessions. And it sounds like to me that there has to be some session meetings where there should be some honest personal conversations. I don't know if you have any thoughts along the lines of whether you might want to work with a committee of the session, you know, a couple of the elders where you're able to have those kind of interactions, those kind of conversations where you talk about such things, or you allow yourself to be evaluated and assessed by the elders, or whether maybe if on a small session that those that at some points in that relationship there should be conversations along those lines.
Yeah, and to work with that a little bit, in our self-care webinar we talked about the idea of allies versus confidants. And I think when you first begin on a session, you have allies, you have partners in ministry where you're all dedicated to the same common cause. But it does not begin that they are all your confidants. And so then you should test over time as you divulge different parts of personal information. How do they use that information? Are they praying for me? And over time, a level of trust gets built up, hopefully with some or more elders. And to me, that's the platform for when things are really not right. Those men, those elders who have proved themselves trustworthy, then you can go to them with something more severe or more serious.
Because I think a part of the duty of the elders, a part of that duty is to care for the pastor and to care for, you know, in response, give him response and feedback for his ministry, and to be an encouragement to him. And sometimes that encouragement is talking about, you know, these areas of difficulty in which he may find himself.
What I will tell you, though, is many churches, by experience, they can slide into an administrative session meeting where they deal with the administrative goals of the church and not really delve into some of that more difficult relational and personal difficulties.
But that's often true even in families.
Yes, it is.
We have a way to ignore talking about the really important things. And I think that oftentimes we're afraid that if we're criticized, the people are really not our allies or our friends, but there's more behind the criticism. I think that's where we don't seem to be able to have a way to be able to speak to one another in the way of building each other up.
And then to bounce off that, the opposite would be if a pastor is leading as a servant and they're leading with weakness, which I think if you look through the Apostle Paul's ministry, how often he talks about how weak he is or how he's struggling or suffering in different ways, to the degree that a pastor can enter that into the conversation with his session, talk about these are places where I'm weak, or this is places I think our church is vulnerable, or we're vulnerable as a session, and to enter that in, that's going to create a context in which again, we can talk about other things like burnout when things like that come as well.
Would another word for that, what you're talking about, weakness, is humility?
Yes.
But a pastor often sees himself, I'm the leader of this congregation, but that seems to me that what marks a leader in the Christian context is a total dependence upon God and aware of his own limitations and the humility that should go with that in carrying out his duties, and realize that the session is there to build that kind of help and build that kind of support. That there should be a common goal, that we're doing this, we have one common calling, different aspects of that, in order to build up the church and to do that to the honor and glory of Christ himself.
And just to work with that a little more,
Yeah.
you know, pastors are not called to be CEOs or to lead as the Gentiles lead. But I think what we're suggesting in leading in this other way, you just don't snap your fingers and say, all right, now we're going to start doing this other way. I think it requires a build-up over time of approaching it in this way.
Changing the culture.
Changing the culture.
So is there anything else that you would use or suggest that how to reconnect once you come to this stage, or once you come to this situation with goals and future ministry? Any other further suggestions along those lines?
I would say at that point, let's suppose you've gathered some important feedback, both from your own self-assessment and from other people. I think at that point, it's time to say, all right, how do I implement these changes? What are the sanctification issues that have been exposed that I need to work on in particular? Or what are ways that I have to ground myself in my relationship with Christ that may have accidentally or unintentionally left what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis in my ministry?
What are your thoughts about in sabbaticals, or a period of rest, or sometime maybe a agreed upon time of just to have some personal time, or to go to a conference, or have a study time? Might there be different ways that burnout could be addressed along those lines?
I think definitely. I mentioned in the first webinar that John takes a weekend every year to visit with these two friends from seminary.
Yes.
And in preparation for that, they read a book of fiction, and then they read a book about ministry or theology, and then they get together and they pray for each other, and they talk about what's going on. Each of them are pastors in different churches. And they do other things. They like to play strategy games, and I think they eat a lot of red meat somewhere in that weekend, and enjoy time outside playing basketball. But I think those kinds of, and I have something similar, and John really supports me meeting up with my two best friends from seminary as well, and we get together. We try to get together every year, and so having those set aside times can definitely address areas of burnout, and are really important to be intentional about and to support each other in having as well. And then I think there's probably more to be said about vacations. I know we've tried to be very routine in our vacations at times, because we found that going to the same place and enjoying some familiarity with our vacation is more restful sometimes than always trying to find a new place to go. And that's just our preference. I'm not saying that's right for everybody, but we found that to be restful. And there are certain places that we can identify. I know when John and I visit his family's house, for some reason his parents' house is very restful. It's very quiet, and there's just room to be still and be quiet, and not be too involved in things. And so figuring out those kinds of rhythms and those kinds of spaces, physical places that promote restoration and renewal becomes important. I don't know if you want to add to that and talk about sabbaticals and things like that. Then.
Yes, I would say, to me the ideal would be that you have already arranged with a session like every 7 years or so that you would take a sabbatical, so that it's expected and it's part of the routine and everybody's ready for it when it comes. But if it's not set up already, and you're in a difficult place, then you may need to ask for one to say, I think I should step away for a little bit and study a particular topic. It's not just taking a break and sitting in a lawn chair, but in some way contributing, or what is the direction of this sabbatical, and making an arrangement with your session to say, I think I need to step away from my regular routines to work on this particular area for a while.
Sounds like you talk about rest, and, you know, having a time away that you really do rejuvenate. You do have that rest. Does that mean stepping away from technology that so invades our privacy these days? What is there any connection between technology and burnout and recovery?
Yeah, I'm smiling because I think we all know how technology can just soak up our time. And typically, not typically, but often the things that we turn to on the internet or on our cell phones, it's entertaining, it takes up time, but it's just absorbing more information, or it's doing something, but it's not necessarily restful. I rarely feel rested after I've been on a laptop surfing the web. Sometimes it's important and I need to,
Yes.
but if the goal is rest, it's rare for me to feel rested after looking at a screen.
Is there anything else that you would offer a suggestion as to how to deal, or suggestions how to recover from burnout, or steps that should be taken that might be helpful to our viewers? Can you think of anything else?
I would say, in part, that's your brothers in presbytery would be people to turn to. This committee, the Committee on Ministerial Care, find resources that will help you in a time of need. It's not a time to be isolated if you feel burnt out.
Lendall, thank you for your work today, and thank you to John and Lindsay for your gracious help in this difficult area. If you have questions regarding today's webinar, please feel free to contact us at the email address found on the screen in front of you. We look forward to serving you again.